Now is a good time to open a bit the floor, so any general thoughts, general comments that you may have in light of the three presentations, feel free to make them. Mike.
Thank you. So, one thing that I thought was really interesting was the first two speakers spoke about religion, the third didn't. I mean, it just popped up, right? But so in Liliana's, so some of the leaders were Russian Orthodox. But what did that mean in practice? What did that mean to them? You get different types, especially across the huge Russian Empire. What does it mean to be Russian Orthodox? And with Josko as well, the Presbyterian sort of, I mean, how much did they feel that their ideas were Presbyterian, or were they just the discourse, the zeitgeist of the day? So there's potentially, an actor's category there, an actor-analyst distinction there that might be worth thinking about. Yeah.
I'm just throwing in that, I glossed over it quickly, but the Bank of Scotland has a sense of being people constant. It's a very Presbyterian organization.
Yeah, you did say, yeah. So yeah.
And so there's this kind of cultural religiousness kind of in there as well.
Do you want to add?
I think that's absolutely right. A good observation to make. I think I was doing far less biographical or autobiographical study than Liliana, but I suppose what I was looking at and concerned with was something like cultural religion. So I was trying to actually make an argument that there's something about this Presbyterian outlook and the way that within Presbyterian thought, society and morality are conceived of. So how is it within this particular way of thinking that that law might be conceived of? And I did bring in some sorts of individual experiences, but only from the point of view of, well, for example, in a certain time period, what did the church do by way of social discipline, etc., rather than individual kind of lived experiences of being a Calvinist, for example. So I very much went down the kind of cultural route rather than anything else.
I think for me it varied, and it depended on the individual. For some, it was very important, self-descriptively so. For others, it wasn't. So it was kind of finding the balance between their own self-descriptions and their own sense of how they define themselves and trying to find that. But also keeping in mind the social descriptions around them, right? So that there were also Jews, for instance, who went to great lengths to not self-describe as Jews or try to not talk about that, but that there are these things going on around them, and the reasons why. So it was, and because I covered a period of about 25 years in the period of their radicalization, these things also changed. These categories were problematized. And so there was that issue. So it was a really difficult.
Okay, there was another comment there.
Really enjoyed the presentation. It's so interesting. But one of the things that I was wanting to ask was the knowledge that you understand from the embryonic development of these people. How do you perceive now world events? Can you transport what you felt about that particular point of time and actually look at what's happening now and almost simulate it in the same way? Are you seeing the same patterns, or speaking of doing other things?
Yeah, no, I've left them behind.
Yeah.
I've had enough after years of it. But you can, but there's things that you can get essence of the experience. Like I can sort of see things. So when someone says, "Oh, well, what radicalizes? Oh gosh, Muslims are becoming radicalized or politicized, whichever," and all of a sudden all these lights go off, and so there are things that you can see certain things. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. You can see perceptions of injustice, for instance. Right? This becomes something that you can feel. You can see that. You can feel that across contexts, across places. That's what I mean by some of the phenomenology and things. So some things are very contextual, and some things you can sort of see outside. I don't know. Yeah, is that?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay.
Yes.
in your case, Jonathan, there is also a bit that problem, no, of how what you researched as an ethnographer in 2000, 2001, to what extent you can say something about the current banking climate.
Yeah,
No?
yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I mean, sort of alluded to it there, but I mean, part of the point is that, you know, a lot of people say, well, what's happened is the banks, you know, used to be regulated, then they were unregulated, and then they got into trouble. But a lot of people, you know, would actually say, well, it's not, you know, they're not that much less regulated than they used to be, actually, if you actually look at the entire context. But what has changed is the kind of organizational culture of a lot of these banks, and the sort of more informal self-regulation that comes around with having a certain ethos around being a certain kind of professional that has certain responsibilities. A lot of that seems to have changed. And I think this data, you know, where you're seeing in the original merger, the tension between, you know, that shift happening before the shit hits the fan, does give you some sort of insights into what was going to happen. You know?
Yeah, but, well, it's a problematic connection, because there was also the talk of the myth of prolepsis, you know. But well, let's move on a bit. There is Arno, you, and then you.
Yeah, I have a question to all the presenters, and that's about the role of documents, how you use them. Reading Foucault, he has made this famous shift of the history perspective on documents, so not to see documents as kind of traces to some other events, but as some parts of history itself. And I was wondering in your presentations whether how if you consider that as not like maybe a binary distinction, but maybe something like a continuum, or like you could use both types of ways of using documents, where would you put yourself on that distinction? Like, did you use documents more as a trace to something else? So I have a feeling, for example, in your case, it might be your documents, you're using them to now understand maybe the mindsets of the organization. Also, your documents are very different, obviously, from legal documents or from autobiographies.
Do you want me to tread water for a minute while you think? I mean, I guess I would say two things. Yes, this is a weird case, and it kind of fits somewhat awkwardly into the whole thing. In that these are documents that I created myself out of interview. It's not quite the same thing as what we normally mean by historical documents. As far as the the kind of Foucauldian archaeology kind of argument, I have to say I'm a firm believer that we live in a real causal world, and that the methodological reasons for sometimes doing that, or sometimes thinking, well, all I know is correlation, I can never be sure about causation, which is kind of a variant of the same thing. Those are kind of methodological strictures that you do to kind of keep you from being blinded by your assumptions. But ultimately, I think there's a real causal world out there, and if you don't go beyond to some hypothecating about what happened causally, you're just being a bit too shy, not bold enough. So that's kind of where I stand in regard to that kind of Foucauldian thing. And the fact of the matter is, I think Foucault wrestled with the question of what when you're doing archaeology or just taking things as the objects themselves, you don't know why they're important, or why pick up that potsherd rather than that potsherd, unless you have some sort of, it's a bit dishonest to sort of think you can just take the objects themselves and use them at face value. And he later had ideas of genealogy and problématique, which helped compensate for that kind of shortcoming of that kind of archaeological idea. That's my quick line on Foucault.
Other perspectives?
A really good question. I suppose for me, I was trying to do probably a tiny bit of both, in the sense that documents I was looking at were, to some extent, for me, traces of what had happened, and strange the realm of causal links. This is what was written, and there was at least a sense in which it was trying to represent something real about the world and what actually was going on. But what's interesting about legal texts is that I think, in some ways they're presented as being very factual and very dry, but actually there's a huge element of self-presentation going on there in terms of what people, the way that cases are reported, and just the way that the law kind of conceives of itself. And so there's a whole kind of other layer, or many other layers, which are also really important to delve into in the legal context anyway. So I try to do some of that as well, and look at the kind of self-understandings on which the law is premised too. That's kind of a dodge of the question, but that's what I was doing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. I suppose it's one thing to kind of have a position on this, and it's another thing when you're sitting in front of the documents in the archives or whatever, wherever you're sitting. So it's sort of, I think I have an intellectual position on it. I think in practice, which is closer to John, but in practice, I think what I wanted to do was vivify the document. In other words, I want, or revivify it. I wanted it to come alive. I wanted to be in that moment in what that document was talking about. And I constantly had to sort of non-archaeologize it, because, you know, I knew what happened 10 years later or 15 years later or whatever. You want to read it for what it was non-teleologically, you know, so you want to sort of make it alive in that moment as you embed it in that moment. So I think that was what I did.
Okay, so we've got two other comments, so we are going to take them together. I ask you to formulate them briefly, and then we'll have brief answers, and then coffee is waiting for us. Yeah, you, and then you, please.
With the interdisciplinary context, right? To what extent do you need to talk their language? Because like you talk about history and then law, and you talk about bank and ethnography. So when you tell a story, how do you pitch it? How do you strike the balance? And then like, you need to look into a lens or to justify your stand. So any tips on that?
The other one?
It was just a brief follow-up from Richard's comment on Liliana's one about the interaction within the group. As you were talking about ethnicity, religion. So I was just curious about what were the relationship within the group. If we're using this label of religion, and the cluster, maybe all the rabble, or just just beyond this label of community, go to the idea of the revolution, equality. So it's not really related to the document.
So that is to Liliana more. So maybe first Liliana this one, and then all of you the other question.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it gives me a chance to get another stab at what you're saying. Yeah, so one of the things that became obvious, and looking back on it, really obvious, but at the time not so obvious when it started, was that these revolutionary groups became safe places for a lot of problematic biographies. You know, that they became places where some of the things that were problematic about you could be submerged because you were a revolutionary first, and then a Jew second, or the dreaded middle class second, or what other problematic biographies became submerged in the revolutionary groupings. But equally, because they were so accepting of everyone, and it was really tolerant kind of universalist places, the revolutionary movement. You could be highly religious. They would have sectarian, highly religious Bolsheviks together with others that weren't, and it was sort of those things are sublimated to the cause. So it was ideological sublimation. It was also a biographical one that allowed you to kind of redefine your experience, redefining yourself. And I think that
Maybe the other question about interest.
That's right. Yeah.
And there is the other question about interdisciplinarity and how we need to speak the language of the other discipline. Maybe any comments on that? The question you made. Maybe, yeah.
Okay, with the interdisciplinary context, to what extent do you need to talk their language? It's like, when you tell the story, how do you pitch it? Because you need to know the audience, etc., right? And then, like, how do you strike the balance within this? you have any tips on doing that? Because I'm doing an interdisciplinary as well, so I'm looking how this structure happens. Because like in Chloe's case, your external examiner was one of the historians. So like in that sense, or like for example, a banker in your situation, or because I missed your talk early on, so I'm not able to. Yeah. So how do you approach that?
I didn't really care who my audience was. I was trying so hard to say something. You know, I think I was just, I wasn't writing it for a particular audience. I was trying to get a social explanation, to try to understand something and express it in some way. And in fact, I use very little, and maybe this is one of probably the weaknesses of the book, is that I use very little in the way of sort of, this theory or this framework or this framework, right? And I don't particularly like work that says, oh, I'm going to take this theory and apply it, like, you know, like doing that. You know. So I used very little of that because I was more interested in social explanation, social understanding. So I didn't really speak to any disciplinary.
So your stand is being neutral of all any other disciplines?
Neutral is kind of assumes I took a position of neutrality, which I don't think I even did that. You know what I mean? I think I just sort of, okay, this is how I understand this story. And so, you know, different disciplines can read it, partly because it's really disciplinarily kind of unanchored, which is a good thing about it. You know. Yeah.
Any other reactions to this about interdisciplinarity?
I would just say that, you know, I'm in a slightly odd position because, as I said, I was trained as an anthropologist and then ended up in sociology. All across that, I've always had a strong interest in political theory and history. So, you know, I've always considered myself a kind of disciplinarily rather unstuck person who just happens to end up in certain places. I'm very comfortable in the School of Social and Political Science, you know, whatever department you put me in. So, and increasingly, I mean, you know, ethnography is, you know, a lot of sociologists will do ethnography, a lot of sociologists do basically historical documentary kind of work. You know, methodologically, there's a lot of traffic moving back and forth, you know, between disciplines. So, I guess it's a long way of saying, you know, I don't worry about it too much. You know, I just think about what, you know, what's a particular piece of research about, and then when I'm writing about it, what is the audience I'm writing to? Are these kind of nationalism studies people, therefore I have to speak to them, or these other people, you know?
I have some sort of sympathy for your position, because I think what I experienced in presenting my work in different places was usually you are speaking to an audience, right? If you're presenting your work to somebody, you are speaking to an audience, and often they will have expectations of what you're going to say. So I was at sort of maybe legal history events, or more purely historical events, or speaking to people who are legal scholars, and often, yeah, they would have different expectations of what I was going to be talking about. So I think being aware of who you're speaking to is helpful, if only so that they can follow what you're saying. And being aware of the different, like I mentioned before about methodological approaches, I think particularly if you're doing something that's going to be examined eventually, you will probably be asked to account for yourself on some level, and so just being aware of the kinds of discussions that are happening in the different disciplines you're dealing with, I find that very helpful, because then at least you can anticipate certain questions and respond to them, even if you take the view that, like, I'm not going to try to go down that particular route. It means that you at least have an awareness of the fact that that exists, right? So that was what I found helpful, and also I think if you if you go and speak to a bunch of lawyers and you don't really understand the sort of hierarchy of, say, even legal source materials, people won't listen to you. So there's a sort of advantage to being sort of conversant with different groups too, because people might be more inclined to listen to what you're saying.
Okay, so maybe we can have a last round of applause for our speaker.